a short time mob are extraterrestrial invaders who steal our time when we're not paying attention. If you're paying attention, they can't steal your time. But if you're not paying attention, they steal a few minutes here, a few seconds there, a half hour here, and you're pretty soon there's a whole day gone. You don't know what happened. The short time mob has stolen your time. So the cure is attention, which Aldous Huxley also agreed with in his novel Ireland. The enlightened ruler of this utopian island has released minor birds that fly all over the island and keep shouting, "Attention, attention, attention," just so everybody doesn't lose their time and drift off.
Welcome to the Hilaritas podcast, brought to you by Hilaritas Press and the Robert Anton Wilson Trust. My name is Mike Gathers, and I'll be one of your hosts on this journey. Hello, and welcome to the Hilaritas podcast, brought to you by Hilaritas Press, publishing the works of Robert Anton Wilson and other adventurous thinkers. Join us as we explore the world of this iconic writer, Robert Anton Wilson, and the many thinkers who influenced him. In this episode, we will discuss the life and work of Aldous Huxley. Huxley, who curiously died the day Kennedy was assassinated, wrote nearly 50 books of fiction and nonfiction, as well as a wide range of essays and poems. In May of 1953, Aldous Huxley took 0.4 of a gram of mescaline under the supervision of psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, who, by the way, coined the term psychedelic. Shortly after his mescaline experience, Humphrey and his wife went on a 3-week, 5,000-mile road trip touring national parks of the Northwest United States, at which point they returned home to Los Angeles, where Huxley spent the next month writing a book about his mescaline experience. The Doors of Perception first published in 1954 and had a huge influence on the psychedelic 60s, inspiring Bob, Timothy Leary, John Lilly, Jim Morrison, Stan Lee, and countless others. In Cosmic Trigger 1, Bob Wright said he got interested in mind-altering drugs through a review of Huxley's Doors of Perception in ultra-conservative upstart magazine National Review. In the essay titled Via Mescaline to Swedenborg, in the August 1st, 1956 issue of National Review, historian Russell Kirk took Huxley's reports as scientific evidence for religiosity, remarking, "Mr. Huxley's theological suggestions, although very briefly expressed, give sanction to both classical and Christian ideas of heaven, hell, and purgatory." Bob the Materialist also noted the strong implication that consciousness was chemical in nature. Furthermore, Kirk wrote that, quote, "Only the most dogmatic, old-fangled materialist," unquote, would reject Huxley's report a priori without duplicating the experiment. As a dogmatic, old-fangled materialist, Bob resented this and argued in his head for months. Then, Bob writes, "The materialist had his first drug trip on December 28, 1962, in an old slave cabin his family rented in the woods outside Yellow Springs, Ohio. 7 peyote buttons would send Bob into a 12-hour, unrehearsed, and incoherent tour of the vestibule of Chapel Perilous, which he considered a most educational and transcendent experience." Bob notes that this experience took place years prior to the media-induced drug panic of the late 1960s, and that under that particular set and setting, the results could have been much different. 40 trips over the next 6 months created a yo-yo effect of ups and downs that left Bob alternating between inspiration and exasperation. But, he writes, "a change in my mind was slowly and subtly beginning to happen."
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good evening.
So I thought we'd just start by asking about you and your career and how you got interested in Aldous Huxley.
Well, I've written several literary biographies, initially of some more historical figures, the 19th century. And one of these was Matthew Arnold. Now, Matthew Arnold is a name you don't hear a lot these days, but he's, used to be taken very seriously. And he was actually the great uncle of Huxley, as a matter of fact. The curious thing is that Huxley never really said very much about him. But he had the same attitude as Huxley of wanting to connect literature and society, and have a bigger vision than just be a man of letters. I think that's something that connects them. generally speaking, I'm a literary biographer and a poet. I've published a lot of poetry. And Huxley always struck me as being a very interesting person, who had as I say, this larger vision of society and the world. And he thought a great deal about the way the world was going, and he's very concerned about the direction it was taking. So, he was a kind of responsible intellectual, if you like.
Nice. We've already sort of mentioned his family a little bit. He had a fairly famous family, right?
That's right. His grandfather was Thomas Henry Huxley, who had a nickname in his day as Darwin's Bulldog, because he was a great defender of Darwin and enjoyed getting into intellectual debates about the validity of Darwinism. And that inheritance, to my mind, is extremely important, because Thomas Huxley was one of, as I say, a major scientific intelligence of the 19th century. And some of those genes came down to Huxley, it seemed to me, because although he was an imaginative writer, he had a scientific cast of mind. And I think this is very important when you come to look at his exploration of mental states and the use of mind-expanding drugs, etc. The scientific starting point is crucial if you're going to understand him.
Yeah. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about his childhood. It sounds like was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he grew up in what you might call, I suppose, a comfortable English upper middle class family, but he had a lot of personal traumas. His brother committed suicide, his mother died very early, and he went to the famous English public school Eton, and as a result of an infection picked up on the playing fields, his eyes were damaged permanently. So for the rest of his life, he would always have diminished eyesight. And one of the interesting things when I was writing his biography was talking to various people about whether, to what extent he could or could not see, and there are conflicting opinions about it. For example, he was quite a discerning art critic. Well, you can't be an art critic unless you can see the art. So he wasn't blind, but he was pretty damaged in one eye. And I think this, in a sense, it made him go. It was a spur to his travel to places where there was light. He needed light. People who have eye problems often need light. And California, as you know, is obviously a place where there's a lot of bright light. And I think that's the real reason why he settled there. Well, there's slightly more to it than that. He was on a speaking tour just before the Second World War, and somebody put it to him that he could make a living out of writing for the movies, as a lot of writers thought they could at that time. And like many another writer, he wasn't a great success at it, but by then he decided to settle there.
So he did spend some time as a screenwriter, though, in L.A.
He did, but I mean, it wasn't really his métier. And, there are plenty of other examples of this, aren't there, of famous writers who thought this was going to be something they could do. And, you need specific skills to be a screenwriter. It's not the same thing as writing a novel.
His writing career started extremely early, right?
Well, yeah, he was a pretty precocious sort of chap. He went to, after Eton, he went to Oxford and, was very successful and knew all the right people, so to speak. And he emerged after the First World War as a kind of, particularly in the 1920s, as a very amusing satirist and very much part of that atmosphere of the 1920s. So I suppose what came to be known as the Jazz Age. And then as his career developed, he became more serious, so to speak. He wasn't just, he began to explore world religions, for example, and the mystical tradition. And I think, again, just like the scientific inheritance, this is a very important background if you want to look at his experiments with drugs, because it explains why he was doing it.
He was into Vedanta Hinduism, is that correct?
He went to this man, Swami Prabhavananda. I remember the librarians in in the Humanities Research Center at Austin, Texas, used to call him the Swami P because they found it was that difficult to pronounce second name. Like his friend Christopher Isherwood, they were attracted to Eastern philosophy. And the thing about Huxley was he always liked big ideas. And when I said he was interested in religion, I don't mean he would never be the type of person who, was a churchgoer or adopting any of the conventional religious forms of expression. He was interested more in mystical philosophy and so on. The significant thing is that he was seeing, I suppose, the limits of pure materialism. He wanted to explore other worlds that he felt were underneath the visible universe.
So you've got somebody with a scientific mind who's generated an interest in kind of the big philosophies of mysticism, and that's
as it has to be said, and this came out in the reaction to The Doors of Perception when it appeared. His critics didn't like that development of him. Many of his critics liked him as this rather acerbic satirist of the 1920s. They didn't like Huxley the Guru. And so you can see, for example, some of the reviews that the book had, or the very interesting reaction of Thomas Mann, who felt that somehow this was a wrong turning that Huxley had taken. Whereas other people, of course, felt the exact opposite.
Right, this is not the Huxley we wanted.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I want to say, perhaps this is the point at which to say it, that I have a chapter on this in my biography, and I am probably more skeptical than many other commentators on Huxley are about the success of this experiment. I mean, are you ready to start talking about this, or am I jumping the gun here?
No.
It seems to me that the outcome of this experiment was more limited than he might have wished. And I use the word experiment advisedly because he wasn't some kind of recreational drug user or sort of funky sort of guy. He was even when he lived in California, he looked like a tweedy upper class Englishman. He was quite staid in a way. And this famous experiment that took place on the 4th of May 1953, he had it felt like a scientific experiment. He had this psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, in the room with him, making sure it all went okay. He dissolved these grams of mescaline in water. Osmond watched him carefully to make sure it was going okay. The whole thing had the feel of a scientific experiment rather than some kind of far out man kind of experience. It was rather, because that's the kind of guy he was. He was a very serious person. Anyway, he took this mescaline solution, hoping that this would deliver for him what he wanted, i.e. some sort of visionary experience, some insight into the world other than the immediate material world around him. And I don't think it was, although the book that he wrote about it and the later one, Heaven and Hell, were extremely successful. And today, these are the books that people read. They read that and they read Brave New World, and many of his novels are not read much anymore. So clearly it struck a chord with people. I remember I read it as a teenager. It was a book that had a kind of an aura of some way. I remember the record cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band with this range of faces. There was Huxley in the middle of them. He was part of the 60s culture, if you like, except that he certainly didn't look like a particularly cool guy.
Tweedy.
He wasn't like, he met Timothy Leary, for example. Now, Timothy Leary was completely different. He was a big advocate of, just this is great, have fun, and all the rest of it. Whereas Huxley remained in control and saw it as a scientific experiment. He did say that he was a very poor visualizer. And I think this comes out that he didn't really, he wanted to see visions. He wanted to turn into William Blake for moments. it didn't work. So he then shifted his ground and said that it was what he was seeing was reality. He wasn't having subjective visions, but he was looking at reality in a more intense sort of way. And there's that famous passage where he said he felt like Adam on the morning of creation. He saw reality as if it was something different, something fresh. And this is precisely the sort of thing that his critics were just, laughing at, because they felt that this was all a lot of nonsense, really.
It's hard to communicate that experience to people that haven't had it.
Yeah, I mean, you see, almost it is impossible. If you go back to the 19th century famous book by Thomas de Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, his attempts to describe taking opium in the 19th century, so many people, so many poets like Coleridge and all these people did, describing the genre of describing drug trips can be very tedious, because you can't recreate for the reader that experience that you had. I don't think. So when the book eventually appeared, The Doors of Perception, in which he described this experience, it was kind of criticized from two directions. From one, the people like the Swami that I mentioned, who felt that to attain to these kind of mystical insights, you had to follow a path of spiritual discipline. You had to work at it for a long time, not just take a swig of a mind-expanding drug. That was one criticism. The other criticism was of people like, as I say, Thomas Mann, who felt that this was a betrayal of the rationalist ethos that he felt modern mind should express. And I just sort of quote you briefly what Mann said. He says, he acknowledged that the book, Doors of Perception, was selling like mad. He said, "It's an altogether, I do not want to say immoral, but must say irresponsible book, which can only contribute to the befuddlement of the world and to its incapacity to meet the deadly serious problems of the times with intelligence." Very much the rational man reacting against an idea that there is a reality that can be accessed by psychedelic drugs.
Did the experiment seem to, we're talking the experiment with mescaline, did that seem to shift him and his perspective at all? He went in with this very scientific mind and wrote about it from a very scientific place in Doors of Perception, but do you get the sense that it left a lasting impression, that it changed him in any way?
Well, I don't think that it did, frankly. As I say, the continuing popularity of the book and the whole story might seem to argue otherwise, but I don't feel that, if you look at what he went on to write and say, and he certainly wasn't an habitual user. He may have been one or two other these strictly controlled experiments, but he wasn't a recreational drug user by any stretch of the imagination. When he died on his deathbed, his wife, his second wife, is said to have injected him with LSD. I put it that way because I'm not 100% sure that that's what happened. But anyway, that's the official version. Of course, we don't know what he experienced. We'll have to take that on trust. So no, I don't think it was a radical alteration of his perspective. But just to sort of go back a little briefly to 1945, when he published this book, The Perennial Philosophy. This was when he was starting this process of trying to understand mysticism, for want of a better shorthand phrase. That was nothing to do with drugs. That was an anthology almost of writing about philosophy, and that's how the experience, and that's how the exploration started. And the drug experiments came later. So his mind was always disposed towards the belief that the material world was not enough, if you might put it like that. So in that sense, he always continued to with that kind of mental disposition. It's just that I don't think the drug experience altered him. To answer your question, others may dispute that, but I don't see any evidence that it was a radical transformation of his creativity, for example.
Wasn't life-changing experience or anything.
I don't think so. As I say, others will dispute that. But.
And you're skeptical of the LSD administration on his deathbed. Could you say a little bit more about that? Just what, in terms of where your skepticism comes from.
Well, yes, good question. Apart from the natural skepticism of any biographer, we'd like to have evidence, and there is no evidence except what his wife wrote in her memoir. Perhaps I'm being unfair. Let's. I'm not accusing her of being a liar. If that's what she said happened, then I suppose it happened. It's a curious moment because we don't know. How could we possibly know a dying man what the effect of that had on him, what he saw, what he felt? We just simply don't know. So it's kind of a bit difficult to say anything intelligent about that.
Fair. Big unknown. Fair enough.
I wanted to ask about, there's a sort of metaphor he uses in The Doors of Perception where he talks about the reducing valve of consciousness, I think is the phrase that he uses.
Yeah, that's right. And he talks about bypassing the brain, because of course that's, I'm not an expert on this, but isn't that what mescaline does? It reduces the flow of blood sugar to the brain or something like that. So it was as if this massively cerebral person was trying to escape the Huxley inheritance, of always having to be scientific and rational and so on. He wanted to bypass that, and try and get through to these other levels of reality, which he definitely believed in. I mean, he may not have been terribly successful by the route of mind-expanding drugs, but he never lost his interest in, or his belief in, the fact that the material world that we see around us isn't the whole story, that there are underlying depths, and this is what he got really from his explorations of Eastern philosophy. And I mean, this question of influence and where people get things from. I mean, there's an interesting example in Brave New World. Now, there's a Russian dystopian novel by Samyatin called We, and a lot of people think, because of the extraordinary similarities of some of the details in those two novels, We and Brave New World, that Huxley derived some of his ideas from that book. As a matter of fact, he hadn't read it. He could have read it because it appeared a few years before his, and even a translation from the Russian appeared. So he could have read, but there's absolutely no reference in any of his writings or correspondence or anything. There's no evidence that he'd seen it. But two highly intelligent writers writing at the same time, confronting the same phenomena, often do get to the same place, even though you can't trace the exact line of influence. They're simply alive at a particular time, and things are happening to their consciousness and their perception, and they get to the same end.
What do you think in the long run was, maybe not the most popular, but the most important of his books?
Well, I suppose you'd have to say Brave New World. That's the one that sells most copies. That's the one that people continue to read, and which, in my view, still speaks to the state of society now. I think it's still relevant. So I think that's the one that makes the most impact. But the Doors of Perception also is, I would say those are the two best-selling Huxley titles by far.
Yeah.
His essays and short stories of the 1920s are probably, on the back burner at the moment.
I wonder if there's sort of a thread between his satirical work and the utopic, dystopic, sort of the social critique there.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think that's Brave New World is, if you compare Brave New World with Orwell's 1984, you can see that there's much more, as it were, knockabout satire in Brave New World. A lot of it is quite comic, although it's underlying serious. So that's where he was using those sort of satirical stills. The satirical tradition is very strong in British writing. So many writers like that kind of mode of expression. I don't think Thomas Mann wrote any comic satires. So yeah, and the reason why I say Brave New World was, in my view, relevant and still, is because he was portraying there a world where, as he put it in his famous phrase, we learn to love our own slavery, and that and you compare what's happening now, the way we allow the tech giants to monitor us day and night. They didn't make us do that at the point of a rifle. We volunteered the information for them. We went along with it, and so that kind of willing march into control it seems to me very interesting, and it contrasts with Orwell's idea that it was all the jackboot in the face. This was Huxley's vision was of a kind of consumer society in which people surrendered their independence and critical faculties, So I think that's why it speaks to us, to me, almost more powerfully than Orwell.
Yeah. So then it seems like in California, he gets a little bit more into Eastern philosophy and meditation and vegetarianism, it says.
In other words, the popular idea of California from people.
Doing the whole LA thing.
Yeah.
And to some extent, there was a place called the Farmers Market in LA that they always used to gather and meet in. And he did have some peculiar sort of dietary obsessions and things like that. If you look at the photographs of him at that time, he just looks like a sort of rather old-fashioned Englishman who strayed in California. I had a wonderful story. When I was researching the book, I went to interview his second wife, Laura, at their home in Hollywood. And we sat on the back veranda, and there were those letters, the white letters, Hollywood on the side or something. And she said that one day her neighbor said she saw Huxley come out of the house to put a bag in the trash. And she said the way he did it, he has this sort of tweedy suit, and he put this down, and he was like a sort of one of those figures in sort of the court of St. James. There's sort of a kind of old-fashioned elegance about him, which wasn't really, what people would, the caricature of laid-back sort of Californian style. He was a paradoxical figure, really, I think, and paradoxical as a sort of an icon of the drug culture, because again, this is something that his wife told me, that he wasn't very happy about the 60s drug culture. He felt it was, but she may have been saying that to distance him from that.
Wilson kind of felt like the Doors of Perception was responsible for changing society's view of psychedelics from, the psychomimetic or miming psychosis to the psychedelic model. I was wondering if you thought that was conscious on Huxley's part, or if that view came from his mysticism, maybe, or.
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting that he chose this man, Humphrey Osmond, who was a psychiatrist living in Canada at the time, I think, though he was British, was very interested in the sort of therapeutic uses of drugs. And that's how he came to Huxley's attention.
Wilson sort of credits the book with changing people's view of psychedelics from just miming like what it's like to be a crazy person, basically, to having this.
Yes. I mean, in that case, I think yes, he did. I mean, he was interested in some sort of positive utility of this experiment. He wanted it to be helpful into principally exploring the human mind. I'm not sure that he would necessarily share, wouldn't disagree with, but obviously Osmond, as a practicing psychiatrist, would have a practical interest in using drugs in a constructive way to help his patients. But Huxley for him, it was just an intellectual experiment, I suppose. I think he claimed to have invented the word psychedelic. Not just two Greek words putting together, mind moving. It's not
right.
It's not a fairly obvious kind of thing to do.
But certainly it seems like Doors of Perception helped legitimize psychedelics. We have this tweedy, straight-laced British intellectual that's taken this scientific approach to this drug. And as you're describing it, it's interesting because he was very serious, but it did have this therapeutic structure to it, like we are now starting to see with psychedelic therapy that's emerging, into the mainstream, where we have a trained clinician administering the chemicals and sitting in on the experience. But that book does seem to have brought up a lot of legitimacy. It's interesting you say how there's a certain force behind it in a way. Like I read it in high school long before I had any psychedelic experience, and I remember just being really deeply impacted by it. It's a book that has a presence.
Oh, it does, and I think that explains why it's still read. And you're right. It was a kind of. I suppose you might say it made psychedelic drugs intellectually respectable, because here was the great intellectual endorsing it, writing about it, and talking about Blake and so on, making it seem like a very serious activity rather than just. I always get this phrase wrong. Turn on, and tune in, or tune in and turn on. I forget what the order is.
Turn on, tune in, drop out.
That's it. With him, he made it seem like a very serious kind of intellectual endeavor, and so it made the whole thing look respectable. Whereas some people might want it to be unrespectable. That's part of the fun.
There's a theme with Huxley, as I'm getting, of the world just kind of heading in the wrong direction after Hiroshima, after the concentration camps, that maybe he's also growing up in the decline of the British Empire, and it seems to have some urgency about how we need to change how we're doing things because we're headed in the wrong direction. And I think you hinted at that earlier when we started out.
I think that's what Brave New World was trying to do. He spoke a lot in the 50s and 60s about what he called the over-organized society. He felt that we were too much being directed by the way society was moving, and here that's the voice of the traditional English liberal, the idea of the individual being free and making their own choices and making their own decisions, rather than this surveillance society, surveillance capitalism, as it's now known, where we're controlled at every turn. That was anathema to him. And I think most of his writing was trying to warn, if you like, about that. And maybe he saw the potential of psychedelic drugs as a way of not just bypassing the brain, but maybe bypassing all these bad things happening in society, that it was a loosening up people's minds, making them open again so that they weren't easily controlled and manipulated. In his day, and he died in 1963, on the same day as JFK was assassinated. At that time, it might have seemed that in the height of the Cold War, that it was totalitarianism, communism, etc., was the threat to individual liberty. Now we see it coming from other sources. The manipulations and the monopolies of the tech giants. I think he would have got stuck into that one very, very firmly.
There's a quote here, I'll paraphrase, but we need to start quickly thinking in terms of ecological terms rather than power politics.
Oh yes. He was a proto-green by absolutely, and felt that we were, he would have endorsed all the ideas about the damage that we're doing to the planet and so on. He would have been firmly behind.
So there's a big part of his concern is in the direction we're headed was also ecology. And
he could never have dreamed in 1960 where the point where we've got to now with the state of the planet.
Can you tell us a little bit about Island, the utopic novel, right?
Yes. What's interesting about that was a kind of that was the kind of antidote to Brave New World. Brave New World was a dystopia where drugs. Sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier. In Brave New World, drugs obviously were used as a way of softening people's brains so to make it easier to control them. In Ireland, I think it was his attempt to try and paint a picture of a positive utopia. And most people prefer Brave New World. People prefer to read about the bad story rather than the good story. And perhaps it was just some people felt it was a little bit too woolly because it was trying so hard to be, describe a positive sort of society. I mean, if you look at the utopian tradition from Thomas More onwards, islands are often central to them. There's sort of these places where everything is right as opposed to everything is wrong. It's not a book that really excites me as much as his other stuff, I must say. Probably for that reason. I think it was a little bit too earnest, in my view. I mean, I once was on a very, very brief sort of radio phone-in or something, and I made this point, a little bit like the Swami, who felt that you couldn't get into the state of alternative consciousness just by popping a pill, which I would have thought would be probably Huxley's position. And some very angry person came on the line and said, absolutely not, because he was a great defender of psychedelic drugs, and said, it's a direct route, and don't rubbish this. So I know there are a lot of people out there who don't like you talking skeptically about psychedelic drugs, and I suppose I myself, for example, have never used them. I've never been tempted to use them, but I don't. One wouldn't prevent other people from doing so.
I think he felt the insight you could get from escaping your conscious filter was important, but throughout his life, he was also doing meditation and yogic exercises and stuff like that. Because I think he also agreed that you could pop a pill and sort of get a glimpse through the window, but you couldn't pop a pill and just become enlightened. He definitely had a very, very scientific view of the experiences.
I mean, in The Doors of Perception, Huxley mentions Blake. Now, Blake was a visionary individual who could see things by drinking a glass of water. He didn't need mescaline. He was, and Huxley wasn't like that. He said, he's a poor visualizer. He was a brain-heavy sort of individual, and he couldn't do that sort of thing, but he wished that he could.
When we speak about the reducing valve, I think our man Robert Anton Wilson would say that we all have a unique reducing valve that creates and shapes our perception of the world, and psychedelics kind of opens us up and makes us realize how subjective our experience really is. And that was kind of one of his core philosophies, how we're each kind of have a unique view of the world that makes us all very subjective. And it's a whole rabbit hole that you can go down with that. But philosophically, there's also just an idea that Huxley had this notion we just spoke about, how we're kind of headed in the wrong direction here as a society, and we really need to make some big changes before we run into catastrophe. And Wilson could be seen as almost continuing that tradition in his own small way, of just very concerned about the way things are growing up in a nuclear armed society and all these things, and so really doing his best to kind of wake people up as best he could to some of the harsher realities we're facing, and create some optimism and hope for the future.
Do you think that meditation and his mystical studies gave him more success at maybe reaching some of those visual experiences than psychedelics?
That's a very good question. I think that could be true. Yes. But that comes back to whether I'm right to say about this famous May morning in California in 1953 was a bit of a letdown, which I suppose I'm arguing that it was, whereas that earlier exploration was much more profound in a way. He read many more books. He explored many more thinkers in that earlier book. And for someone like him, that probably was the way forward. But the thing is, that was purely an intellectual exercise, whereas the experiences he was describing in The Doors of Perception were more, I nearly said more real, perhaps that's not the right word to use, but more deeply felt, more bodily in a sense than these cerebral explorations of past philosophy. It's interesting, his friend in California, Christopher Isherwood, they both shared this interest in Eastern mysticism, and maybe Isherwood took that particular strand more seriously, took it further, was more committed to it than Huxley was.
Okay. Well, just switching gears a little bit here. One of our other hosts on the show mentioned an essay. I believe it's called "The Best Picture," an essay on Piero della Francesca's Resurrection of Christ. It's an essay about this fresco that he considers to be the best picture out there, and it talks about the journey you have to go to get to this place and this and that. But he talks about art in a very, he's such an intellectual, but at the same time he talks about this art, and it's about the authenticity of expression of the artist and the authenticity of the artist. There's just a different side to Huxley that kind of comes out for me when I read this brief essay. Do you have a sense for that? Just, beyond the intellectual, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Oh, yes. Well, very definitely. I mean, I remember that essay, but not, it's so long since I've read it, not freshly enough to say anything sensible.
Sure.
But I know what you mean. Oh, yes. I think, yes, I wasn't trying to suggest, I suppose, that what is described in The Doors of Perception was fake, or something like that, or cooked up in some way. I think it was very genuine what he was describing. Describing how he looked down at the fabric of his jeans and saw it in a radically different light and so on. I think that was real. I think he did see that. So those sort of experiences were authentic, absolutely. And for someone who was used to always being taking the cerebral route, that was very important for him, to as you say, there's kind of opening doors that were had previously been closed. I mean, the doors of perception.
I wanted to ask what you thought some of his more important correspondences were. It seems like he had a lot of cool, famous correspondences.
We mean with other writers and thinkers? And
Yeah.
Well, I think one thing, you're right. He did indeed. He communicated with people all over the world and with other people. But he was also rather curiously quite. I think he lived quite a quiet life in a sense. He didn't. I mean, I've just written a paper that I'm giving at a conference shortly about his relationship with D.H. Lawrence, which fascinates me because Lawrence, on the face of it, was everything that Huxley was not. He was a almost a shamanistic kind of figure sometimes. He ranted and raved, and the exact opposite of the cool intelligence of Huxley. And yet they hit it off to an extraordinary degree. You might have thought they were the last two people to click, but they did. And that tells you something about Huxley, about the way his openness to it. He may have been a particular kind of, you said earlier, straight-laced Englishman, but he was open to all sorts of other experiences. His mind was always open. I mean, he even explored, for example, flying saucers. Most people say, absolute nonsense. But he said, well, okay, before we say it's nonsense, let's just find out a bit more about it. You know what I mean? So his mind was always open. He didn't shut anything off. But I can't come back to this. When he was writing Brave New World, he was in the south of France in the summer of 1931, writing this book. And he was there with his wife. He knew a few people in the area, but they kept themselves to themselves. He was quite I won't say isolated, but he wasn't constantly frequenting the company of other intellectuals. You know, he would correspond with people, but he was his own man, I suppose you might say.
What did he and T.H. Lawrence connect on?
Well, I mean, some of it would have been this a shared view that the world was moving in the wrong direction, sort of thing, because a lot of Lawrence's writing, as you know, is almost ranting about these things. Though I've got a lot of time for Lawrence, and that I think I wouldn't say that that Lawrence was a mystic, but he was certainly believed that the logical scientific explanations were insufficient. That you had to the imagination and the transforming power of art and so on were more important than sort of intellectual analysis and getting to the root of these problems. Maybe Huxley was envious of Lawrence's greater freedom of imagination in these things. But I think Huxley still gets mentioned, still gets talked about, but perhaps not to the same extent. And it's fascinating sometimes to meet older people in the UK who read their first encounter with him in, sort of the 1930s or 40s or something. He was hugely important to a lot of people as a kind of, almost like as a kind of liberator. He was someone who was saying something different. And I don't think, to be perfectly frank with you, I don't think he's having that impact now on young people. The two books we keep mentioning, they'd probably be aware of. I mean, I remember I was doing some research in California, in the Huntington Library, and I was staying in a motel, and opposite the motel was a college, and I went in there to get some stationery, some pad, and I saw that there were some books, and they were clearly the course books for the students there. And I just sort of walked along these bare white shelves, these piles of course books, and I came to Brave New World. There it was, So it's obviously still on American college syllabuses. It's still, people are reading that. But I don't think he's the liberator. The interesting question is, who is the Huxley of today? And say in the UK. And I find that a difficult one. So I'm not going to try and answer that. but he certainly was a very influential for a lot of people.
That concludes our episode. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. We invite you to visit hilaritaspress.com and buy all the books. And if you haven't already, check out the Starseed Signals, Bob's love song to Timothy Leary from the early 70s, which went unpublished and recently unearthed by Adam Gorightly from the archives of Discordian OG Robert Newport. And you can find our podcast at hilaritaspress.com/podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to Christina Pearson and Richard Ross of Hilaritas Press and the Robert Anton Wilson Trust. A big thank you to poet and biographer Nicholas Murray for taking the time to talk with us. Look up Nicholas online at nicholasmurray.co.uk, where you can find his Huxley biography as well as his latest book on poetry, City Lights, and much more. Thank you to our audio engineer, Ryan Reeves, for technical production and music, and thank you to our producer, Ian, for putting it all together. We look forward to sharing our interview with John Higgs for episode 4 on Timothy Leary, which will be available on the 23rd of December. Until then, I am your host, Mike Gathers, signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor et Hilaritas.
Attention, attention, attention.